Hello everyone. I'm really sorry that I can't be at the event today. I would like to thank Dr. Edwards for filling in by answering questions at the end. Now, if he isn't able to address your questions, and I find that extremely difficult to imagine, and not just because he's my boss, please do not hesitate to send me an email directly. The objectives today are for you to be able to relate the strength and limitations of two recently published studies, determine the applicability of the results to patients in your practice, and to describe how your practice may or may not change as a result of these studies. We will achieve these objectives by seeing what a true practice-changing trial looks like, learning about a new critical appraisal tool for assessing positive trials, and applying this tool to some recent studies in diabetes. Unfortunately, I lead a dreadfully boring life and thus have no real or potential conflicts of interest to disclose. I'd like to start by sharing my ideas about what constitutes practice-changing results versus works in progress. Practice changers in my mind are very well designed studies. They are designed in a sensible and realistic manner that's reflective of practice, and they have results that are broad applicability. I'm frequently asked to present on topics like this, and really struggle to come up with more than one or two studies per year that are truly worthy of the practice changer moniker. Contrast that with works in progress. Now, although they may influence practice, the extent of change they should affect may need to be measured based upon questions about the study design, the consistency of effect, or long-term safety of the intervention, and or the applicability of the results to populations other than those studied. Now, this isn't to say that these studies aren't important. Instead, it's perhaps more accurate to view them as essential groundwork for the subsequent studies that address the limitations noted above. It may be helpful to see a study that I believe has earned the trowel of a practice changer. But first, I have to tell you about an important research institute in the United States. The National Institute of Health is a wing of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In 2015, they invested more than $30 billion in health research. Now, you'd like to think that being 2017, they will have spent significantly more, but I'm not too sure if you've heard, but Donald Trump was elected president recently. Yeah, for real, no kidding. Anyway, he wanted to cut funding to the NIH. And this is an issue that's still before Congress, so stay tuned for more updates. The National Heart, Blood, and Lung Institute is one of the research institutes contained within the NIH. And anytime that you see an NIH or NHBLI funded study, I encourage you to sit up and take notice. They aren't always perfect, but are often extremely relevant because they are funded by the United States taxpayer. This usually means that the research is carried out in North America, which helps with generalizing the results to our patient populations, and the research questions are clinically relevant, instead of questions that are perhaps more interested with marketing a drug or device. And this brings me to the practice changer, the all-hat study. Now, before I hear any former students groaning because they've heard me speak about this study like only 36 times through their 4 years in the program, remember, your degree can be rescinded up to 10 years after graduation if I go back and review the IPFC 9 grades again. I've spoken about this study so many times because it meets all of the attributes of a practice changer. It was designed and sponsored by NHBLI scientists and was the largest hypertension trial ever. The whole purpose of the study was to determine whether the newest and most expensive drugs were better than the old, trustworthy diuretics. And the all-hat study involved more than 40,000 patients with hypertension in the United States. Patients were randomized to one of four treatment arms: clothalidone, lisinopril, amlodipine, or doxazosin. And this is a great demonstration of perhaps the most important aspect of having a non-industry sponsored trial, and that is the choice of comparators. And based on a thorough literature review, the NIH scientists felt that the best thiazide-type diuretic was clothalidone, not the more commonly used hydrochlorothiazide. Patients were followed up for 5 years, and a strong clinical endpoint was chosen. The main results surprised a great deal of people. At the end of 5 years, there wasn't a difference between 3 of the groups in terms of fatal coronary artery disease or non-fatal MI. And it should be noted that halfway through the trial, the doxazosin arm was halted due to a doubling in the risk of developing heart failure, which turned out to be the first practice-changing outcome for this trial. If clinicians were surprised by the primary results, they were absolutely beside themselves with the secondary outcomes. Patients taking clothalidone had a lower risk of heart failure, stroke, and combined cardiovascular disease compared to those taking lisinopril. Additionally, patients taking chlorothalidone had a lower risk of heart failure than those taking amlodipine. Two other changing considerations that came out of this study include the recognition that chlorothalidone may increase the risk of developing diabetes by about 0.4% per year and about 0.8% per year compared to amlodipine and lisinopril, respectively. It also put the spotlight on the widespread and, I would offer, potentially inappropriate use of hydrochlorothiazide in place of chlorothalidone. In addition to remembering what a practice changer looks like, there are tools to help you determine whether a clinical trial should drastically change your practice. One of my favorites for this is a list of considerations from a recently published review in the New England Journal of Medicine. I won't read each of these considerations now, instead we'll apply them to some recently published studies. And the only other consideration that I think is missing from this published list is what was known about this topic prior to the study, which is where I will begin when I talk about diabetes medications and cardiovascular risk. Once upon a time in the early 1990s, diabetes drugs were demonstrated to lower blood glucose concentrations, and this was associated with a lower risk of certain microvascular complications of diabetes, for example, the need for photocoagulation therapy for diabetic retinopathy. In the later 1990s, there was cause for celebration when metformin became the first anti-diabetic drug to be associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular events. Unfortunately, critical appraisal gurus spoiled the fun for everyone, like they always do, as this data is now thought to be of low quality and inconsistent. Even worse, in 2007, rosiglitazone was removed from the market by the Food and Drug Administration because it was associated with an increased risk of myocardial infarction. As a result of this finding, the FDA also issued a guidance to the pharmaceutical industry, mandating that manufacturers of anti-diabetic drugs demonstrate that their drug is unlikely to be associated with a 30% increased risk of cardiovascular events. I'll say that again. They have to show their drug doesn't increase the risk by 30%. So stop for a moment and reflect how many people don't think that statins are all that hot because they reduce risk by only 20%. Kind of interesting, isn't it? In 2013, results from these FDA-mandated trials started rolling in. No difference in the risk of MI, stroke, or cardiovascular death between saxagliptin and placebo. No difference in the risk of MI, stroke, or cardiovascular death between alogliptin and placebo. And finally, no difference in the risk of MI, stroke, or cardiovascular death between sitagliptin and placebo. It was at this point that the family doc who runs our diabetes clinic came to me with a puzzled look and said, "Am I supposed to be happy about these results that look to me like a whole lot of nothing?" Lo and behold, the world was about to change. Two studies reported results that were unprecedented, the MPAG-REG and the LEADER study. And I realize that many of you haven't seen me in years, so I include this photo of my reaction to these studies when they were announced, just to refresh your memory of me standing in front of you in this lecture hall. Before we get into the appraisal, this slide highlights various design characteristics of the trials. There were more similarities than differences. Both were placebo-controlled studies, one with empagliflozin and one with liraglutide. Both were multinational, enrolled patients with type 2 diabetes. The primary outcome was the same, death from cardiovascular causes or non-fatal MI or stroke, and both had a median duration and follow-up of around 3 years. Perhaps the main difference was the MPAG-REG study enrolled patients with established cardiovascular disease, while the LEADER required either a history of cardiovascular disease or elevated risk of developing it. This slide depicts the demographics of each study population. The average patient in both studies was a 63-year-old non-North American male who had diabetes for more than 10 years with established cardiovascular disease. So let's take a look at the critical appraisal questions suggested in the recently published review. And we'll start with the first 4 questions that are bolded in this slide. Starting with the MPAG-REG. First question is, does a p-value of less than 0.05 provide strong enough evidence? It's important to remember that there isn't anything magical about a p-value of less than 0.05. The p-value simply represents the likelihood that the results of the trial were a false positive. The smaller the p-value, the lower the likelihood of this mistake. The p-value for the primary outcome in the impact reg is 0.04, which means that there's a 4% chance that this result is a false positive. When a trial is the first of its kind like this, it would have been nice to see a smaller p-value to increase the confidence in the result. The second question is, what is the magnitude of treatment benefit? And there are two ways to look at this, looking at the relative risk reduction or the hazard ratio. The 95% confidence interval gives a range of the most likely treatment effect. In this case, the range includes 0.99, and that's a result that's barely better than placebo. The other way of looking at the magnitude of treatment benefit is to look at the absolute risk reduction. In this study, the probability that a patient benefited from empagliflozin after taking it for 3.1 years was 1.6%. And conversely, there was a 98.4% chance that a patient taking empagliflozin for 3 years did not benefit from it. The third thing to consider is the primary outcome clinically important and internally consistent? So cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, and stroke certainly is clinically important. And is it internally consistent? Well, the answer to this is yes and no. The primary outcome was driven by a reduction in the risk of cardiovascular death. Note the smaller p-value, which suggests a low likelihood of a false positive. However, neither myocardial infarction nor stroke were reduced by the use of empagliflozin. While myocardial infarction rates went in the right direction, and that is they were lowered, there were more strokes in the empagliflozin arm. This was not statistically significant, but given that this is the first time this drug was studied in a cardiovascular outcome trial, it will be important to keep an eye on this as more information becomes available. Finally, are the secondary endpoints supportive? And in the case of the impact reg study, the answer is yes. The risk for hospitalization for heart failure was reduced in those randomized to empagliflozin, which helps to explain how cardiovascular mortality was reduced. Applying these questions to the leader study, the p-value, does it provide strong enough evidence? The p-value for the primary outcome in the leader study is 0.01, which means there's a 1% chance that this result is a false positive. And although this is slightly better than the impact reg study, it's hardly a definitive result. And the magnitude of treatment benefit, similar to the impact reg, the range of hazard ratios includes 0.97, a result that's barely better than placebo. And the absolute risk reduction is 1.9%, meaning that in this study, a patient taking liraglutide for 3.8 years had a 1.9% chance of benefit and a 98.1% chance of no benefit. And was the primary endpoint internally consistent? Well, in contrast to the impact reg study, all three components of the composite endpoint were internally consistent, with significant reduction in cardiovascular death seen and positive trends towards reductions in the risk of both myocardial infarction and stroke. In terms of secondary endpoints, also in contrast to the impact reg study, there were no statistically significant reductions in important secondary outcomes. The next three questions will be considered on the following slides. First, it is important to note that neither study was stopped early for benefit. And this is a strength of both studies because trials that are halted prematurely for benefit systematically overestimate the treatment effect. And second, is the trial large enough? Small studies lack power and can provide inaccurate estimates of treatment effect. Both of these studies used the FDA-mandated non-inferiority margins for studies investigating cardiovascular risk for diabetes treatments and can thus be considered large enough. And third, it is important to examine subgroup effects to identify any groups that may benefit more than another group or individuals who may be more likely to be harmed than not. This should always be done with caution, as the p-values are often not adjusted for multiple testing, and this will increase the risk of false positives. The impact reg study did have two interesting subgroup effects. It appeared that older patients appeared to benefit more than younger, and so did those with lower hemoglobin A1C values compared to individuals with higher values. Again, these must be taken with a grain of salt because of the number of hypotheses tested without adjustment of the p-values. These will be things to watch for in confirmatory studies. The leader study reported subgroup effects suggestive of more effect in patients with existing cardiovascular disease and in those with eGFRs of less than 60 compared to those without and greater than respectively. The same caveat exists with these analyses. They are far from conclusive because of multiple hypothesis testing. The next considerations have to do with safety. In the MPAG-REG, there was an increased risk of genital infections in subjects randomized to empagliflozin, which had been expected based upon the mechanism of action of the drug and the results of previous studies. In the LEADER study, the safety outcomes were slightly more concerning. The incidence of neoplasms, and in particular pancreatic carcinoma, tended to be more common in people taking liraglutide. The trial was not powered to investigate the effect of liraglutide on cancer risk, so this possibility will need to be studied further. The last two considerations are concerned with the trial design and generalizability of the findings. Both of the studies were funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Now, contrary to popular belief, industry-funded trials are generally every bit as well designed as non-industry funded studies. However, they are more likely to report positive results, which is likely a result of bias creeping into the design. Sources of bias for both of these studies include the fact that the comparator in both studies was placebo. How would each drug have compared to an active treatment, such as insulin or another add-on anti-hyperglycemic agent? Additionally, the short-term duration of these studies makes it impossible to determine the effects of using each drug for longer than 3 years. Are the effects durable? Are there important safety issues, for example, cancer? Well, on the basis of this evidence, we can't answer either question. On the topic of study design, it should be noted that the Canadian Expert Drug Committee for the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health highlighted several concerns with the trial design from the MPAG-REG study. The report on the LEADER study has been put on hold because the manufacturer voluntarily withdrew its submission for consideration of expanded use criteria. Perhaps the most important consideration of these trials concerns the generalizability of the results. It goes without saying that standards for medical care, including access to health care, standards of practice, and other factors, differ widely between North America and the rest of the world. In fact, simply look south of the border to identify a vastly different healthcare system than ours. However, it's also very important to note that individuals in Canada have very different risk profiles than those of people who live in other countries. For example, more patients in Canada with hypertension are at their goal blood pressure than in the United States. It's perhaps not surprising that our rate of control is 3 to 7 times higher than those in developing countries like China and India. But there are nearly 2.5 times as many at goal here in Canada than in England, which also has a universal healthcare system and is a Western European country. Similar numbers exist for the prevalence of smoking. The lighter the shade in this diagram, the lower the prevalence of smoking. So note the very dark colors in Eastern Europe and Asia compared to the lighter colors in North America. And looking at specific numbers, Canada has vastly lower rates of smoking prevalence than many European and Asian countries, which is where the majority of the patients in the LEADER and MPAG-REG studies lived. Even if there was North American data available, it is questionable how directly applicable it would be to Canadians. A recent study published in JAMA highlighted that the cardiovascular mortality varied by as much as 8-fold between different counties within the United States. The most recent data I could find on cardiovascular mortality for Canadians suggested that our variability is less, from a low of around 100 per 100,000 in Quebec to as high as 200 in 100,000 for Newfoundland, which is still less than the average reported for the overall United States. And the reason why all of this is important is to help estimate the probability of benefit in the patients that we care for. This table compares several factors with the MPAG-REG, LEADER, and ACCORD blood pressure studies. With the exception of where the patients were from, 100% were North American for the ACCORD blood pressure study, and differences in the number of patients with a previous cardiovascular event, almost all other patient parameters were remarkably similar. Note that the annual cardiovascular event rate was 50% lower in the placebo arm of the ACCORD study. And that means if you used either liraglutide or empagliflozin in an accord blood pressure type person, the expected benefit would be about half as much as was seen in the IMPACT-REG and the LEADER studies. So this slide summarizes everything that we've covered, and in the interest of time I won't review it in detail. But I will share with you that in December of last year, the FDA did grant empagliflozin an expanded indication for cardiovascular risk reduction in patients with diabetes and established cardiovascular disease. The vote was 12 to 11. Perhaps they considered some of the concerns that we've discussed. Several of you will be aware of the fact that there was a recently published study investigating the cardiovascular safety of canagliflozin. For practice, I suggest reviewing it using the checklist I used today. Feel free to email me with any comments after doing so. And you thought you'd never get another homework assignment from me. I get the last laugh. In summary, there have been some very intriguing studies published in the world of type 2 diabetes recently. The use of a critical appraisal tool identified a few areas that require additional scrutiny and may limit the widespread adoption of these interventions until further information is available. Thank you very much for your attention.